Instead of boring versus interesting, the contrast is why something is going to be remembered. Why you don't remember license plates unless they say ass kicker, right? Which, a little bit of trivia, was the license plate from one of the antagonists in Con Air with Nicolas Cage.
Okay, and we are live with Mr. Captain Wright. Voodoo Influence is back, and let's start again with the quote of the day. It's I think it's actually by a quote just from a podcast interview. Most lives are dictated either by a story they are telling themselves or the story they are telling others. Blind spots and masks. That's quite, that's quite aggressive. But with this kind of in mind, I want to transition into the question that I guess we sort of get a lot from people, or people ask, which is like, what kind of stories should our clients, or should I be using in my bio?
Everybody has stories, and I think the big issue is that people aren't willing to use them because they're afraid of embarrassment. But there needs to be something flippin' memorable in there.
How is storytelling different in business than like normal storytelling, like in movies or in cinema, in books? Like, is there any difference between that?
Okay, so big picture, when you're like writing a bio, and just to frame it out a bit, the situations in business that you would need a bio that tend to spark the most anxiety is when you're getting interviewed, for a podcast, or if you get invited to an event and you're going to be sitting on a panel or maybe even a keynote, right? The typically they'll ask for headshots, which for certain people is the primary anxiety. That would have been my wife. For me, I still stress about like what version of my bio I'm going to send over, and send over in the press kit or email over to somebody's. The from a mechanics level, just the actual structure. Typically, I'll always provide three. So I'll provide something that's super short, kind of like byline status, like you would see next to an author's name in an article. And then I would provide something a little longer, like something you would see, embedded in a press release, maybe more like a short paragraph, and then something a little longer, like you would see in the author flap of a book. So those are kind of like the three rough lengths. Oftentimes, when you're actually, working with folks that are more seasoned in press, they'll have much more specific instructions, word count, because they need to fit it in things, especially if it's going into print. That's something people forget, is they'll stress it, and it tends, more often than not, it tends to go long, and it tends to go boring. And then you mentioned things like movies and differences. I don't think there's any difference at all. To be honest, I think all the same structure is there. And in the quote you were talking about the stories we tell ourselves, I used to be obsessed with this concept of a story-worthy life. You could even consider it as one of my principles when I was younger. And I still have a little bit of that in me. I wanted to do things. I had an aspiration to live a life and do things in my life that was worth telling someone else in the form of a story. Like, man, this will be a good story later. And I actually made a lot of major life decisions based on that. I don't always recommend that. Certainly, like thrust me down some wacky little rabbit holes, and it created some like epic fails, uh, and some nervous breakdowns. But it's not something that you know I certainly don't consider it a principle anymore. But at the time, it was important for me. I mean, I felt, and then for this balance, and there's the psychology here, right? That do I feel like I'm an interesting person, or do I feel like I am a boring person?
Mm.
That's the balance there. I would say that the older I get, the more I appreciate being boring. As far as like my life, like, oh, nothing dramatic happened today or this week. Oh no, the my, you know, like just I stubbed my toe. Ooh, whoa, super interesting. Like the most interesting thing in my life, honestly, like lately, has just been, you know, all the shenanigans with clients and trying to grow the business and stuff like that. It hasn't really been that interesting. So
You live for
let's see.
the
So just recapping real quick. Structurally, like tiny, like tweet length, you know, like a paragraph length, and like maybe a 3 paragraph length bio. Uh, and then when you're thinking about it, you do need to think about that balance between boring and interesting. And boring isn't necessarily bad in a bio. That's something that we can unpack a little bit if you want.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's very much connected to. We can also touch on like that for me is like one of the most fascinating topics is the topic of like stories versus reality. Of like I've been explaining like how what's the actual difference because we inherently tell stories. We've been telling stories. We always been
Mm-hmm.
telling stories. I mean, at least since the invention of like language, I guess, or whatever form of like
Mm-hmm.
communication. Um, so for me it seems like for now the conclusions is that like one is that in story there is this principle in movies. I think Chekhov's gun, I think you know this, like that
Mm-hmm.
every element of the story needs to be significant, and that
Yep.
seems to be the case with stories, that there's like not much of like trivial and boring stuff. So actually that part is like cut off. And then there is this part that stories don't care about time, only events. Like that, the time is kind of like bent. So, like the reason I'm talking about this is because when you're talking about like interesting versus boring in the bio, I think the interesting also like, kind of gauge is also like reality versus fiction. Like how much do you kind of turn it like so the gauge on like fantasy and how much do you stick to kind of the
Mm-hmm.
ground, like what actually happened, the facts, right?
Yeah, I know. It's a that's a damn good way of looking at it. Actually, is so reality is typically is what they say. Reality is always more interesting than the story. Sometimes, like that like true crime in podcasting and television right now is become a huge category. It's become like the category. Uh,
It's like
as
true
far as
stories from
well,
crime.
yeah, the true crime is its own category in podcasting now.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, like the people that did This American Life, like those producers did their next big thing was a true crime podcast, and that kind of made the genre really really popular, and it's all over Netflix now. And I I'm not a fan myself, just because my own palate is different now. There's some people that get older, they can't have spicy food anymore. I don't do true crime podcasts anymore. So, but so you've got a few different scenarios. We'll just rule of threes, break it out. So scenario number one is you're in a part, in a spot in your career that the reality is you're not a big deal, and your life feels pretty boring. Okay, to you, like nothing quite interesting. Okay, scenario number two is you're on your way up. Maybe you've won an award or two, or had a couple of cool clients that you worked with, or know a couple of celebrities, or worked for a company that's hard to get into, like a McKinsey or one of the first 100 employees at Google or something like that, right? And but you're not recognizable. And then situation number three is you've been around the block a bit, and you've got a list of accolades and accomplishments. So we could kind of unpack each of those separately, and then and each of them actually requires a different sort of structure.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
yeah,
So
so
let's. Yeah.
yeah, so distilled, right? If you're in that first category, where it's like there's just nothing that interesting about me, or the interesting things about me are things I don't want to share. Like if you're like a frat boy in college, and like pulled like the beer pong record. It's I would say use it. I would say use it. Like everyone has stories. Everybody has stories, and I think the big issue is that people aren't willing to use them because they're afraid of embarrassment. But there needs to be something flipping memorable in there. So I would say just remove the whole this whole requirement of being interesting. Having sizzle. Like yeah, you'll get there, but make a living out of fucking up your life like I did, right? so I have tons of stories, and most of them ended in tragedy, emotional tragedy.
That's also a form of story
Fetal
tragedy.
position on the floor, weeping, big old
Right.
ugly man tears. But you don't need to be interesting. You need to be remembered. So that's something that when I was working with Oren Claff, that he drove it home, and I'm unsure where he got it from. Might be an evolutionary psychology thing or something, but this idea of contrast and familiarity. So instead of boring versus interesting, the contrast is why something is going to be remembered. Why you don't remember license plates unless they say ass kicker, right? Which, a little bit of trivia, was the license plate from one of the antagonists in Con Air with Nicolas Cage. Uh, yeah,
The
the
nerd.
yeah.
Movie
So
nerd.
yeah, but then there's familiarity. Like, where does this belong?
Mm.
Like, where does this person belong? Like, what shelf do they belong on? And then there needs to be some aspect of familiarity. So you'll see if you want a master class in this, you go to an online dating site and read the bios. Pick out the ones that are memorable. I know it sounds strange. Everyone, I'm
Girls
sure,
have the
knows
best
someone that has an
bios.
online dating profile somewhere. But if you can see the ones for the folks that look memorable, there are certain lessons to be buried in there. Typically, they have humor. There's
Yeah.
some level of specificity. Like in my bio, I talk about the fact that I've got an idiot, like blab boxer mutt, who's an idiot, and I've got a blind mini dachshund. Those are both true things. That is a reality. But I didn't say that I had two dogs. Saying I have two dogs is just exposition. It's just like, hey, here's the reality. If you add specifics, it adds texture and it makes it more interesting. And now it's like, oh man, yeah, I've got a bunch of weird dogs too. Or oh, I know I know what shelf this guy belongs in. You know,
Mm.
someone that takes in strays. uh, so that's an exercise you could go through, is adding specificity, where that adds texture to the story, and to even the boring elements. All right, and it's not a resume, and that I don't. That's probably when we
Mm.
move into the second category, what is the biggest problem is people try to craft it like a resume, right? I remember when I used to be a headhunter, like someone that like a recruiter, helping people find hard to find skill sets in the marketplace and convincing people to go work for them, and in some cases to move cross country to work for them. And I was okay at it. I wasn't great at it. I was okay at it, but I've read thousands of resumes, and none of them are really memorable. And a lot of people, when they get more experience in business, there it starts looking like a resume. People will put bullet points in there, like here are my accomplishments.
Then there are like too many specifics because you talk about talking like specifics, right? But then you can put too many specifics. Like you try to make everything important when it isn't, right?
Exactly, exactly. That's why the rule of threes is important.
Yeah, I love it.
Like how much could you store in your head? Dunbar, there was all these different bits of math, right? Dunbar's number, which is like roughly 150, depending upon who you talk to. How many people could you have a personal relationship with? They've got there's the limitations of the human mind. There's only so much we can take in, especially, and keep in mind that people are not likely to actually pour over your bio. They will skim your bio. They will
Yeah.
skim your people skim. And they're really dog or really pissed off if you invoked some form of an emotional response from your event or your book or your article or whatever it was that you're doing that your bio is attached to. Uh, they might read it a little more closely, or if they're a stalker. But in that case, avoid doing the resume thing. And when you have a little bit of career under you have, and this is the basic story structure, kind of is the granddaddy of story structures, which is hero's journey, right? And then there's a bunch of other subcategories under that, but it's Star Wars, and you could actually create a miniature version of that in a bio. So, and then on the end of the more experienced people, if you're older, I would say uh, the humble brag comes into play. So
Mm.
I prefer that. My wife's been giving me crap for it lately. I think there's a whole 30 Rock episode about the humble brag. That's why things like the hero's journey exist. That's why, some of these things I would consider rules, like using specifics, uh, using contrast and making sure they understand like who you are.
How much does context play a role in choosing your biostructure? Like meaning, like would you just would you consider just having like one bio that tries to work everywhere, or would you tweak the bio depending on who's gonna be reading that, like what medium are you you putting it in, and all the other factors.
That's why I opened up when we started talking about bios with the length of the bio. Like the shortest form, we're not going to be able to fit a hero's journey framework in a tweet. I imagine it's possible. I'm sure. There's someone's like challenge accepted. Like the Barney Stinsons of the group, and are going to try to, you know, uh, unpack an actual like hero's journey or like the monomyth into a tweet sized bio blurb. Uh, the I would say that for the shortest version, it's very much just like in a story format would just be introducing the character. And one of the differences between cinema and a written format is that we don't have the visuals when we're writing. So in a movie, part of the hero's journey is establishing the old world, the
Yeah.
ordinary world. And it's
Ordinary.
usually it's typically a big, you know, panning shot. They've got B-roll of the neighborhood. Maybe they work at a factory and they show the hustle and bustle and they slowly move in onto the main character, right? So, and that usually it's just some sort of soundtrack sitting on top of it, no real dialogue, and it's establishing it. Then they introduce the character, and that would be the little blurb. This is a 38-year-old bearded man who looks a bit disheveled, you know, with a hard hat on in a factory. And it looks like he's got a ring on his finger, so it looks like he's married. So there you go. There's your little blurb. This is who this guy is. All right. So that's the thing. The medium length would be a bit more arc. Like what has this person done? Where have they traveled? That's another question you could ask is where have you traveled? And it's not so much I've traveled to Greece and Italy. It's more of like I've traveled to this industry or this other industry.
Mm.
That's why you could go in there and like where you go to school is sometimes important. Little things like that. That's an example of specific. If it's a school no one's gonna know, you could just say, I went to a tiny community college in Ohio. That's interesting. You know, why aren't
Okay.
you a guy if you went to school in Ohio? And then with the long form, we have a chance to actually introduce conflict, introduce some arc, put in a beginning, a middle, and an end. So that's the basic premise. There is the and it could be a bit more aspirational. You'll see in longer bios they'll talk about what their next project is, where they are going.
Mm.
So it's kind of the snapshot, the baseball card. Then you've got the, well, actually less than established. Like the front of the card, like here's who they are and the basic stats on somebody. Then you've got the thing that talks a little more about where they've been, and then the longer bios, who they are, where you've been, where you're going.
Okay. And tying it back to influence, when are you writing bio, are you thinking also in terms of like, who do I want to influence?
Well, I definitely need to write it for the audience. If you're speaking, yeah, I'll use a real scenario. I was invited a few times to teach some webinars, like a 3-part series of webinars for the Arts Alliance, which these people that help, I would say, medium-sized theaters, not movie theaters, like theaters like performance theaters and performance spaces, where they're bringing in some bigger acts, bigger shows. People are accustomed to paying $50 to $150 for a ticket to see something, and their audience is that they wanted to get butts and seats for the events, and then there's a lot of the musicians and performance artists that wanted to get booked at these venues because there's a circuit in the United States of these venues. So that's what they asked about. So I pulled things related to music and performance and film and into my bio. So I talked a lot less about that. I don't think I mentioned at all that I was ex-military. I
Mm.
didn't mention the Air Force Academy, even though it's like, man, if you've gone to Harvard, you should mention Harvard. Well, you don't need to really.
Yeah.
Is someone that runs a Moroccan band? Are they gonna care or even know the significance of it? Probably not.
Yeah.
Right. So
So,
so I
so,
did,
so they
but
need
yeah,
to.
I just shared that part of my story is that yeah, I started my business in 2009. You know, basically managing bands, and then it turned into a marketing empire. Kidding, right? So there's little tricks of the trade you could throw in there, but uh, when you're playing the status game, depth and or breadth, right? So in that case, I think made it to my 10-year mark. Actually, had I? No, I hadn't yet. I hadn't even been in marketing 10 years yet, which is like single digit experience.
Ooh.
Hmm.
same as the whatever. I'll not finish the sentence. But
Yeah.
no, but you said something interesting. You said that the audience needs to recognize it as significant. So
Hmm.
that seems to play a big role, like whether the audience will recognize a certain accomplishment, or I mean, maybe it's just about accomplishment. I don't know, but they need to recognize it significantly. If someone doesn't have that frame of reference, right? They like it will not be important for them. Is that
Yeah,
what
I
you're
mean,
saying?
that's why things like the hero's journey exist. That's why, some of these things I would consider rules, like using specifics, uh, using contrast, and making sure they understand like who you are. Like at the end of the day, I'm a dude that lives in California who runs an email marketing company. Right? That's the category I belong in. So okay, and I'm an
U.S.
owner, so I'm a boss of a company. Since 2009. So I've been doing it for a while. All right. That's the basics. When you go in and for like the Arts Alliance thing, you know, uh, in a short bio, I would mention, I would squeeze in there and use my very low character count, that I've, started out in, booking events and managing artists in Seattle, Washington. All right, so that gives it relevant. It's not as interesting, but the fact is that is where I started. So I was able to use that piece of the story to help make relevance. Now the expanded one, I include stuff about the stuff I've done in the film business, and which adds that kind of like more texture, different kinds of fabric, right? And then in the long form for art, I probably can find it. Actually, I can find the original, like, short, medium, and long bio that I gave to Arts Alliance back then. It was guys uh, place I headquartered up in Portland, and that I think was useful. But as I said, there's going to be so many scenarios that you don't know. You may not be that big of a deal. I'm not that big of a deal right now in most spaces. Like you know, I mean, there's people that know who I am or may know about one of my companies or something, or certainly they've known some of the companies I've worked with. But like, it kind of falls under the so what category. That's the humbling part of this whole process as you start unpacking. It's like, well, so what? So what if you own a marketing company? So what
Yeah.
if you host a podcast? So what if you've traveled to 15 countries? So what if you've been featured in Bloomberg? It was a quote. No, it wasn't a feature. You know, lies versus reality.
So it's that the humble brag you're talking about. Okay, I got it now.
There's a guy I work with that he maps out in his bio on his website that like here are my five most epic fails. Like he just talks about businesses that didn't make it.
I want to unpack one of those stages because in the beginning you touched on the
Mm.
three stages. I
Yep.
think the first one is probably the most popular, like where people are starting out. So that's where the second is probably the hardest because it's like you are not in the beginning, but you're not at the end. And then the third one is this, you said, like the, kind of humble brag is one of the strategies. So maybe I don't know which one you want to unpack. Like just one for now for today.
Yeah, I mean,
Like about some like what are some story structures for this
yeah.
part of your
So
life?
uh, there are cheat sheets out there. So I mean, on anything, Christopher Vogler, is good. Dan Harmon's Story Circle is good. If you just want to generate ideas, like all the different formats and different archetypes surrounding it, TV Tropes is a great website that I use sometimes if I get stuck. But I would just cautionary tale right out of the gate. I would avoid the rags to riches story.
So what's that? Can you unpack that?
The rags to riches story is that I grew up on the streets, raised by a single mom, you know, living off a of fish sticks and broken dreams. And
It's like
then
the
I
it's
had my first business, washing cars when I was in middle school and worked my way up through all the ranks in corporate and then decided to strike off on my own. Right? Like, do you see how boring that comes off? It's like,
oh,
okay, like, so what? Right? So, but there are certain cases rags to riches are interesting because you could show that, hey, you've struggled. So it's okay to talk about the struggle in your story. That, like, yeah, after five failed businesses, like, there's a guy I work with that he maps out in his bio on his website that, like, here are my five most epic fails. Like, he just talks about businesses that didn't make it. And then
mm,
in the beginning, humble brag, and then he lists off, and now he's been able to do X, Y, and Z. But the archetype he's playing there is that he's he's got the battle scars too. So that's the shelf he's going to be put on, a survivor, and now he's pushed through to the other side, and now he's kind of developed into the old grizzled mentor. So, like, in the hero's journey, and we've talked about this many times, but in the hero's journey, you've got the hero and the mentor and
obstacle and
the villain, okay, the shadow,
yeah.
So you've got these different archetypes, right? The threshold guardian, the ally, the trickster. So we have all these different characters, but in business, oftentimes when you're in that later category, you're now more in the mentor category.
Mm,
And so talking about less rags to riches and more, I've overcome multiple obstacles, and I was scared too. I'm like you. So it's that relation, like, oh, I can relate to this guy. It's not brag, 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 brag. It's like, yeah, he's accomplished some stuff, but it looks like he earned it. He hustled
okay.
his face off.
Yeah,
So
like a bit of like the underdog. We love the underdogs, but it's a bit overused,
yeah,
as you
David
said.
versus Goliath. There's a whole
Yeah.
bunch of.
No, but what
What was
about
the other one that you wanted to unpack?
I think that one that ties what you're saying, it would be interesting. The student becomes the master, right? Like, so that's one kind of a story type. Like, what's
Yeah, yeah. The When you see that a lot, and like some of my favorite, like, martial arts films will have, you'll have the great training montage. Like in Karate Kid, you're the best around, nothing's gonna never bring me down, right? And these great, training montages. They have a whole, like, spin off of one of the South Park movies about the training montage, and it's a it's just a compressed form of a part of the hero's journey. Actually, is the trials and tribulations portion where they're getting multiple teachers sometimes. But one of my favorite stories is where your master, the person that teaches you, actually was the villain the whole time.
mm,
And that may not be reality, but there's a lot to be learned in that kind of archetype. Because you've learned, and then you were able to become the master. That was Neo in Matrix. He was the student. Morpheus coached him through it. Morpheus arguably knew that he was going to lift Neo above him. There's a lot of religious imagery in that film too. That
mm,
Matrix actually is. I mean, Star Wars and Matrix are excellent, excellent examples of hero's journey, just played out differently. So if you look
yeah.
at, like, Luke Skywalker, that's like oh man, I'm an orphan, and my aunt and uncle have been killed, and there's nothing left for me anymore, and I'm super insecure, and I don't want to be a hero, right? That's him. Like, Neo didn't want to be a hero either, but he was like, he didn't want to, like, really become the master either. He wasn't excited about being the badass. He just was kind of stumbling through life.
Mm.
I thought was, uh, so yeah, the student becomes master. One of the things you could do in your bio is talk about who your teachers were. I trained with, you know, if I was a stunt man and I said, hey, my early days, I trained with Jackie Chan, that would be impressive, you know, or if you want to be true, you you tried to work with Jackie Chan and didn't make it through the audition.
But it's
Right?
still like the bias of the influence from mere association tendency, or whatever. It's like
Yep.
just
Yep.
mentioning
Skimming.
someone.
Yeah. Yeah. People will skim it and it's like, dude, I never said that. Yeah. You worked for Jackie Chan, right? No, I tried to, and it was a complete fail. like, like
Yeah,
I, uh,
like
I tried to
people.
run a marathon. I made it 5 miles in, and it took me 8 days to recover. Like uh, but talking about, instead of accomplishment, kind of that boring ladder, like that, it could be more, based around the fact of where you learned. You started at the school. You learned on the I learned on the rainy streets of Seattle, slinging posters. That was true. I actually did that. That was where the business started. It was postering and postcards. You know, so that's true. And in that particular case, and then you could talk, and then after a few thousand campaigns, I actually got pretty good at it. That's a humble brag, right? Yeah, after about like 11,000 campaigns, and they got pretty good at it. Uh,
Yeah, no,
but
that's mhm.
yeah, and you could use that as an opportunity to talk about something interesting too, like also tried to learn guitar. Tried.
My take is from my side is for sure that that you need to, well, that like looking at like movies or TV shows or books is a good way to find inspiration for different structures. That's
Absolutely.
definitely one. Two, that there's different formats that you should write your bio in. So like a short, medium, long, and that kind
Mm-hmm.
of really kind of dictates of like what you write in it. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the length that you have available. Really is a big factor. And also that the big key as a principle would be to aim for being remembered, because people skim the bio. So including details, stuff of significance for the audience or the people that would be reading it, um, and then or also some unusual things, and also like or even like failures, because I think that the reason it works is the same reason, sort of. That's what I'm thinking, is that why Game of Thrones like worked, like became so huge, is because like people got so sick of all the like finally the good comes on top, then the tragedy comes where like the good actually doesn't always win, and they often die. And so that's kind of, I think, like throwing an unexpected into into the whole mix. um and I don't know, did I miss something? Like what would
Yeah,
be
I
your?
mean, it's people need to know what shelf you belong on. So as I said, some of the it's including something in your bio about, like, okay, who is this person? There needs to be some level of clarity. You don't want to be like all, and I've made the mistake of this in some of my bios, is being all clever and all quirky. And it's like, wait, who are you? What do you do again? Like, why should I care about you? So there needs to be, I wouldn't call it selling, but some level of labeling. You know, like one of my bios could read like, Nate, uh,
Father.
runs a family of email marketing agencies, out of Oceanside, California, right? That's that can be all right. Like, it's not very exciting, right? But you could start adding in through rewrites. You start adding in more texture, But when, as I said, with the longer bios, the ones that might be on the About Us or the About Me part of your website, uh, you definitely want to have some level of obstacle in there. As I said, the rags to riches is an all right structure. It's just overused. So the structure itself is boring,
Mm.
right? Because it's overused. So and oftentimes they just look at other stories, look at other bios. I mean, I collect bad emails, I collect good emails, I collect great, bios that are interesting. And sometimes it's because they're humorous, sometimes it's because they're concise, like they're able to communicate a lot in a very short amount of time. And sometimes it could be based around accolades. Like this was the culmination of it. Like he got, but usually it doesn't end. And then he won a Pulitzer. Then he got a Nobel Peace Prize. You know, but that you could use that as, and now he's working on, or she's working on blank. There's some level of momentum, and that's one of the reasons stories have arc, beginning, middle, and end. Is that we're trying to get to show that you're moving, you're not static. And that's
Mm.
probably the main thing with the medium length bio and a longer bio, is you need to imply and show, if you can, that you're in it, that you're an action figure, you're not a background character.
There needs to be also like velocity, right? Like in the whole, like
Mm-hmm.
kind of it
Velocity and show
doesn't.
the direction, and it doesn't have to be interesting. It might be like, hey, and now you're going back to school to learn sociology. You know, I thought about doing that for a minute, and then I went and actually got a sociology textbook, and it was like the most boring thing I've ever read in my life. So I was like,
Yeah,
okay, let's discard that idea.
yeah.
Uh,
Sociology is it's good to be studied, but not as a sociology in university.
yeah, it's still in the research, having to do studies. Like, hey, I'm going to recruit a bunch of college students and make them take questionnaires. And now it's a huge important part of like what they do with there, and that's where a lot of our great thinking comes from, those studies. But man, ah, yeah, I don't like doing that.
You're a marketer, not a scientist.
But that, I'm gonna go ahead and I know we're like running out of time here. That right there is is I think a super important point. Is that, am I a marketer? So with the bio, it's sometimes an opportunity to actually, you could be real and be a little aspirational about it. I would say that lately, over the past few years, I've become more of a writer than I have a marketer. I've been spending time this year trying to bone up my marketing skills and dig deeper into that space, but that's I would say I self-identify more as a writer. Now, are people going to care about that as much? I don't know.
Yeah, the story you're telling yourself versus the story you are telling others, right?
Oh, Konrad has
Yeah,
pulled it all together. He's
yeah.
closed the loop. The student
Yeah.
hath become the master. All right, dude. Take it easy, man. This is good.
And before we finish this episode, a few questions for the audience, for you guys watching, before you go. So, first one, which life phase are you finding yourself in right now? From the three phases we talked about, the super boring, the nothing is happening. Two, you are kind of on the upswing. You got some first awards or big accomplishments, and the third one, you're kind of at the more on the end of your journey, and you just trying to maybe figure out how to humble brag with the best. So the second question, like, what would you say is the difference between storytelling in business and storytelling, in movies or in books? Like, what have you, like, based on the conversation and your knowledge, do you see any difference, and what are kind of your takeaways? And the last one, what biostructure would you like us to unpack next in the next episode? Because we're gonna release these episodes every week on Wednesday. And the next time we talk between me and Nate, we can, kind of uncover some more, different stories, different story types, or maybe some other questions that you might have. So, please put your comments, thoughts, and questions in the chat. We'll make sure to respond to each and every one of them, and then we'll pick the best, and maybe we'll make them the topic of the discussion on our Voodoo conversation. So, thanks again for watching this episode, and I will see you in the next Voodoo Weekly Jam. See ya from me and Nate.